Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's 2:10, not 4:05. I apologize for the wrong information. We continue this part in English. Gentlemen, thank you. This part in English, and it's about Europe and China, a challenging relationship. We have 4 panelists here and 1 from London. Let me introduce all of them to you. First of all, I have Lauri Paltemaa here to my left, Professor East Asian Studies. And then we have Juha Aavuori, Professor International Relations, Hanna Smith, Research Director, Hybrid Center here in Finland, and then Mikael Matlin, Professor International Relations, and then via video link from London, Chatham House, Dr. Yu-Ji, and I apologize if I don't pronounce it correctly. Welcome. Do you hear us?
Yes, I hear you very well, and I think you pronounced my name perfectly. Thank you so much, Susanna. Delighted to be here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to you too. This will be interesting. So, China and Europe, a challenging relationship. We hear more about challenges every day, and usually, well, if you're in Brussels, it's about 5G, it's about technology, it's about this. But it's a tough bone for us Westerners. It's our biggest trading partner, as China has opened its economy and trade for us. You have Chinese, not you, but Chinese have quietly, strategically placed themselves more and more into our continent by buying and investing. Now, Exhibit A on China's policy, I think, is Africa. Europe lost East Africa a while ago, a long time ago, by demanding African countries development in democracy and rule of law. It's one of those core issues that we Europeans like to export. Chinese don't care as much as they themselves don't share our values as we see in Europe. Now my first question is, if we lost Nokia and Ericsson as technology giants and leadership in 5G phone technology, how can we continue with a country now when I bet all of us carry a phone or computer device made in China? We made this technology in Europe, and now we lost it. Who wants to tell me how in the world we lost this? I have 3 professors here and 1 in London. Okay, Matlin.
I could pick up the gauntlet and start. First of all, I don't know sort of if we lost really anything. I mean, in many ways we are a stagnating continent, getting older. We haven't put a huge amount of investment into research and development and so on. And Europe has been very good at regulating and setting standards, as we all know. But we have in the world today, in terms of technology, basically 2 ecosystems. One of them built in Silicon Valley, and the other one built in China. And China has built that very meticulously, very carefully over the past decades. Very smart, I would say, keeping sort of high enough barriers in order to be able to develop a domestic technology ecosystem. And so, I mean, now we were all sort of quote-unquote panicking because we realize how far we have fallen behind in many areas. But it's not necessarily sort of because of China, it's because of what we ourselves have done. And
we got fat and content.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, just if I can continue just very briefly, I mean, you mentioned this investment and buying up and so on, but in many ways, I mean, what China or Chinese companies, I should say, are doing in Europe is just a natural extension of the fact that China is a big economy these days. And if you just look at the stock of capital investment, China is not huge. For most countries in Europe, China is not even among the biggest investors. So we're paying attention to it basically because we don't understand China. We're fearful of China right now because we lack this understanding. We keep talking about China, but we breed these cliches about China basically all the time, and we don't really sort of see always the big picture, which is often that our biggest investors are from other European countries or the United States, and China might be number maybe 14 or something in a given country, EU country.
As one panelist in our last discussion said, 1,000 years in China is not a long time. Hanna Smith.
Yes, well, if I may slightly challenge this starting point in the way that, first of all, there was lots of ifs. If we lose this and that. And then the second one is the big question, are we in fact behind? In the way that there is the potential, we are afraid of it. There is a lot of development, but I think the big picture is a little bit more nuanced. In the way that even if China is big, it has a lot of money, it's been very active, sometimes even aggressive, and shows much more, there are also limits to its capabilities. And specifically, I think from the previous panel when I was listening to it, one big aspect was international cooperation. And here, of course, if European Union works together with United States, for example, or other entities, even India in this case, which quite often is in fact in competition with China, then suddenly the picture starts looking quite different. And since I'm quite odd one out in this panel, in the premises that actually my specialization is Russia, so I could also bring Russia into the picture in the way that specifically when it comes to this technological side, Russia is leaning towards the West, towards Europe also in cooperation-wise. There is a certain developments, etc. So I would actually challenge you on the starting point of the question and definitely put the emphasis on the ifs, in the way that there is a lot of potential partners, European Union, European countries can do. I'm not 100% sure that we are so behind on the technological thing, and that China is alone quite a lot in this one from my perspective.
Are we afraid? And we don't
Exactly, but this is a good question. Why are we so afraid? And here, again, if I quickly may, from the Russia researcher perspective, this is a similar discussion that we have had relating to Russia. There is something odd, there is a fearful or kind of feeling a threat. Situational awareness is not united. Specifically in Europe, we are coming to it. Interestingly, in Russia case, European Union is much closer than almost ever before when it comes to the Russia analysis, the threat from Russia and so on. But China is now the rising star on this dividing situational awareness. And that's an important fact that we should pay attention to.
Juha Vuori.
Yeah, I'd also like to challenge the notion that China doesn't care if it takes 1,000 years. To my mind, China is the most impatient country in the world today. They have all these resources, they have accumulated great feats, yet they do not get the type of recognition internationally that they desire. And that makes them very irritated and impatient. Also, there are many developments in China that sort of are coming to a head. And we're sort of at the cusp of something new, and obviously the pandemic and the trade war with the United States has sort of accelerated some of these developments. And even the cliche of, you know, what is the relevance of the French Revolution, that discussion was about 1968, not the original French Revolution. So there's all sorts of myths and sort of distorted views about China. And I think it would make a lot more sense to sort of take a clear look at what's going on.
If you bear with me, Doctor, we'll take the last comment here, and then you can comment on all of them and give us your view. Yes.
Sure.
Next one is Lauri Paltema.
Yes, thank you. I have to agree with everybody else already here that the picture is much more complex than this, that China is rising and we can do nothing. But if we take this case of 5G now, because it tells us something about how China is working and also the differences of our systems. We here used to rely on 4G, and that's basically because our system, companies, were running on market principles. They were barely making profit on 4G, while China was already developing 5G, not on market basis, but government was putting lots of investment and money on developing it because it wanted to become the first country to basically break it into the 5G. And it did so. But that was based not on the market logic like here in the West, but on the logic of the government subsidized markets or government controlled markets like in China. And this is what the Chinese can do on any specific one technology, I would argue. They can do this, but they cannot do it on every technology all the time. So we are now alarmed by their rise here in Finland, especially because of Nokia, and obviously this comes very close to home. But I would be less alarmed by the idea that we will go wholesale into Chinese technology. Well, the Chinese manufacture great 5G, but they manufacture it based on with American technology. So basically, they are also very dependent on West on this, and it's not really their technology. It is shared international technology in many ways, and this also needs to be, considered when we talk about the Chinese technological leadership. It is much more fragile and much more complex than just that they come and take over our. Well.
Now I give you the floor, Dr. Yu. It'll be interesting to hear what you say.
Sure, I pretty much agree with everyone said in here, but I think we shouldn't really take a binary approach when we come to discuss with China, because by all means that whatever the slice of China we talk about in here, and China is not going to go away. I think if we're speaking about fear, it comes from that human nature of unknown. And obviously, this is the country run by the world's largest political party with 95 million party members and one party system, which have never happened in the world, and to lead the world's second largest economy. So it's a very funny structure. But that has also come into the moment of that fear, the fear of China itself for not being able to firstly handle the economy very well. And secondly, the fear that perhaps the rest of the world will leave China in isolation. I mean, I'm pretty sure that many of you have heard a sentence that the assessment from the Chinese senior leadership suggesting that the world is changing, therefore the East is rise and the West is decline. But that is only the first half of the story. And second half, which has not really been widely covered, reported in the Western media, is actually that China facing unprecedented challenge which have not been seen in the last 100 years. So clearly, the senior leadership is extremely worried about, firstly, its internal popularity because of the economic slowdown, because of the pandemic. And secondly, it is also fear that itself being isolated to the rest of the world. I mean, just to be frank, China's economic success in the past 40 years are built on a first round of economic globalization, precisely because China maintained a relatively peaceful relationship with the West, not the other way around. So if China decided to go to a different path, and whether it itself can continue to sustain its economic growth, and I have a serious questions in here. And secondly, that after the population already enjoyed the economic benefit that they have in the past of years, if they continue to run this rather erratic foreign policy with the West, it is not very helpful for its own population, for its own well-being of the population. So I think it's a permanent contradiction in here, on the one hand, that China does in the West in order to help to facilitate its own economic development, whereas on the other hand, running this a very much assertive and isolated foreign policy. So we're in that really funny dilemma, and I still really didn't see whether President Xi would turn a corner at some point. So that's one thing. Now, secondly, what I want to say in here is in terms of Europe, I think what we should be aware that after this pandemic, and China itself will scale back diplomatically. So less focus will give to Europe, but much of the focus will given to the Asia-Pacific economies, and precisely for China's own economic development. And also in the past few years, that most of the state capital investment in Europe are not that so much successful, but rather created a reputational damage for China itself. So it perhaps will be worthwhile to have a rethink on this.
But EU and China had 3 meetings just recently, and they were not very successful when it came to how do we deal with each other, meaning trade. EU has these value-based demands, and of course China never has taken them too well. Now, if we are afraid, If we are a little bit behind, we lost the leadership to China in technology, and we need it now in terms of climate change, in terms of our energy efficiency, in terms of intelligence, communications, everywhere. How do we do that? Is there any possibility for Europe to get back on the lead? Is it necessary? Hanna?
Yes, it is possible. Let's start from that perspective in the way that if we just now looking at the European Union on its own and not necessarily in connection with its partners and United States and so on. So in that way, I think already the first panel was saying, if we're talking about the EU as an economic power, so then there's always possibilities relating to that. It depends on where the priorities are put, where the money is put, how much, from Mikael's point of view, this research and innovation arena gets attention, etc. So there is a lot of things to be done. But the interesting thing, and I would like to pick up the points that was raised also here, is that the premises that they managed to look so powerful, and therefore we get kind of a bit scared, then that already affects, and this is something then what we do at the hybrid COE is also kind of what types of a means they are trying to influence and interfere in our internal space so that we would make wrong decisions. And this one, the authoritarian regimes, whether it is China or Russia, are actually quite good. They manage to use information and other tools to kind of play with our minds and effect to it that we think that they are very powerful. So we just heard in the way that there are internal problems in authoritarian regimes in China, but also in Russia. So to break the notion that these are almighty and authoritarian regimes are so powerful. That's kind of a first step. And then the second step is to put the money there where we see that there is a need for it and not just believe that without doing things happen.
You had your hand up, and then Matti.
Yeah, I mean, if Europe wants to take the lead in technology in other fields, we need to invest in that stuff. And in Finland, we have a so-called Minister of Science who stoically cuts once again from the Academy of Finland rather than putting significant investments into research and technology development. That's why we're falling. Many European countries have been doing the same thing. They haven't been investing in their future. If we want to take the lead, we need to invest. It's very simple.
So we got fat and content. And then
no,
we stopped being too interested.
We got lean and ideological.
Matti.
I have another point, but just to add on what Juha was saying. Yeah, I mean, just not many years ago, we were putting in about close to 4% of our GDP into research and investment at the time when China was putting in 1%. And now China is putting in, I think, more than we are, and the trends are going in different directions. So to me, it's fairly simple. We're not investing in our future, and China is investing in our future. But my actual point was to get back to your EU-China thing, is that I can understand to some extent why you can be very confused in Beijing, because we're sending very mixed messages all the time, not just from the EU and the EU member states, from the United States. Seemingly whatever China does, seen from Beijing's point of view, is wrong. We want China to be a responsible stakeholder, to pick up part of the burden and so on. But of course we want that to happen on our terms. For the longest period of time, EU-China was about trade and commercial relations. Yeah, a little bit of values, but I mean the message that China was sending was that these values are not really important when it comes to the real business, so to speak. So you could be mistaken for not taking them seriously, because even if the EU Commission was saying values in some member states, but there were always another batch of, or many member states who were basically saying, no, I mean, it's business as usual, and so on. And to take just this, or to get back to this investment thing, just a few years ago, we're basically welcoming Chinese investments in Europe, in a lot of places, hoping that the Chinese would come in and invest more. And now, when they did, what happens? We slam the door shut and say, no, don't come here. Why are you coming here? You're threatening, you're trying to take our best companies and so on. I'm not saying either way is right or wrong, but we have gone from one end of the spectrum, which was to some extent extreme, not seeing any kind of security issues just 5-6 years ago in Chinese investments, to the other extreme, basically, of seeing only problems in that. And to my mind, I mean, probably a more balanced view would be appropriate. I mean, certainly there are issues that we need to pay attention to. There are certainly investments that should be restricted or at least be screened or be followed up. But not every single investment is necessarily problematic. There are also sort of sound commercially based investment decisions.
So let's not get Huawei in, close the borders, ain't the solution. They are spying anyway.
I'd say it's much more complex than that, and you have to be more discerning and develop the tools for that. Yes.
Paltema.
Yeah, I just have to be up from that in more general sense that this change that Mikael was describing. A few years back, nobody was seeing China as a threat, at least in European foreign policy making. Now it seems that everybody regards that there is a China threat. And actually fundamentals haven't really much changed. What changed was that America happened to have a president who brought this issue to the fore, and with a very undiplomatic manner. Of course, we are talking about Trump and his government and his administration, which really brought the China threat to the core of American foreign policy. In a very, it's curious that the Obama administration had the exactly same reading of what was happening in China, but it worded very differently its policies. Then came Trump, and it outright started to yell, there's a China threat. Everybody has to now act accordingly. And Europe has caught on. It has basically followed the cue slowly, but now it's picking up. Yes, there is a China threat. I'm calling for more level-headed and a clear-headed approach to China. Yes, there are challenges. China is not a saint in any ways in international policies, let alone in domestic policies. Nevertheless, we must not get agitated and let the fear take over when we talk about China. China is a rational, big international selfish actor. And we have to really base our own analysis on China on objective things and not irrational fear that China is taking over. And that's unfortunately what has been happening also in European policy making, following too much the American lead here.
Dr. Yu.
Yeah, just 2 points on this. I mean, the country where I choose to reside, in UK, for example, and also have a very similar debate. And earlier this year, when the UK government issued the integrated review on strategy, and China is featured quite large section. So obviously, on the one hand, would portray China as being a trading partner, but then on the other hand, as a security threat and security challenge. For any medium-sized country, this is going to be the most difficult question: where exactly to place China on which spectrum, either on the spectrum of being a total threat or on the spectrum that being a partner on the certain elements that they could work with China, but perhaps on other elements that the countries should criticize China's behavior. So I think it's a mixed bag in here. But when it comes to the issues on technology or technology advantage or whatever, I mean, China is not exactly now leading the so-called global technological the spectrum. And what we have seen here is that China using the latest 14th five-year plan, the latest economic blueprint, that using technology and innovation, a self-driven technology innovation as a national investment strategy. It is no longer just industrial policy in itself, but cross-cutting all different spectrums, that being a national investment plan, and encourage any individual, any Chinese individual who have worked abroad in the high-tech sector to go back to those countries and being rewarded personally as well. It doesn't sound very communist or socialist to me at all, but surely it shows that how much leadership is very much concerned itself, so lagged behind in terms of competing with the United States and the European Union. So I think Europe should not really be too fearful in terms of China's competition, because China is also playing a catching up stage rather than just taking the lead in this case.
Well, for some reason, globally, China is a big question mark for everybody. You said that after this pandemic, China will turn inwards more and be a bigger player in its own neighborhood. The Pacific, also, it's a geopolitical superpower. If we talk about those 5-10-year terms, sort of like a plan in Chinese government's mind, or the leadership of the party, what do you think they want from Europe, from us, in partnership or trade or?
Sure. I mean, quite simple. I think two things the China wanted, or depends on which side of China we're talking about. We're talking about the central government in Beijing. That firstly, China wanted to have the recognition that China is a proper international player. It's not being seen as some kind of like a strange creature, as being outlier out of this current international system. So China wants to have the recognition. Now, second thing that China wants is to continue to have the European investment inside China, not the other way around, but while keep those money inside China for China's own benefit. So the European investment continuously come into China. This is two things. And perhaps the third thing is when it comes to the transnational issues on climate change, issues even on building infrastructure across the world. You know, while we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, the G7 put forward to the so-called B3W, I mean, those two things could be somehow jointly to work together. So I think that's the three things that China wanted from Europe. But whether Europe wanted to offer, that's another thing. And also this largely depends on China's own behavior towards European countries and also towards its own neighbors. Because surely we have to admit that there are some diplomatic mistakes that China has made in the past and make China being rather unwelcoming across many parts of the world. So we have to admit that there are mistakes that we made in the past.
Excellent points. Can we work on that? What China wants, do we meet somewhere there, Hanna Smith?
I would like to pick up on the point on this US lead on the policy and also what type of a threat China is. It's true that US is the one who's loudest on this one, and European approach or EU's approach has always been, even when it comes to, if you compare now US approach to Russia, it's the loudest and definitely most kind of a radical. But there is in European Union also, I think we heard already from Foreign Minister Haavisto's speech, the competitor, partner, and then systemic rival. And the problem here is the systemic rivalry. This is the authoritarian regime versus the democracy. And the authoritarian regimes, and China here, feels a threat from the democracy. And quite often the authoritarian regimes always feel that attack is the best defense. So I would actually say that the reason why this systemic rivalry aspect has brought China more to the threat side from the European Union is based on their own activity and action. And that has started to increase in kind of questionable means inside of the European Union also. And little by little, if this trend continues, the systemic rivalry understanding will increase. So I would definitely say that there is a much more nuanced and not only US-led kind of change in the EU's policy, and the change is due to the fact that China has slightly changed its own policy. It has felt that it doesn't get what it wants and starts using these questionable means. A little bit the internal politics, the regime survival feeling is behind it. So importance is definitely to understand and analyze also the internal dynamics in China, because from that we can also see how it will be in the world politics.
Mikael Macklin, you want to say?
Yes, to follow on this, I mean, we have tried. When I say we, I mean the EU, the Commission has tried to sort of have its cake and eat it sort of and define the relationship now, or redefine the relationship as being all of these things. It's about collaboration, or China is a companion in some areas of policy, and it's a competitor. It might be a rival in some value-based issues, and it's very reflective of how we're trying to sort of do our China thing. But it also means the situation is very different if you compare to, for example, the situation between Western Europe and what we had during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because there was an overarching military threat picture at the time that was relatively widely shared among policymakers at the time. We don't see that in the EU today. It's really hard to get a consensus on China. At the very least, there's always one or two member states that seems to always, or are always of a different opinion on almost any issue. So, and then if you bring it to the transatlantic dimension, even harder. So there is a fairly strong bipartisan consensus in Washington these days on China, which is one of the rare issues where actually Democrats and Republicans agree these days. But how do you get that even close to something resembling that kind of shared picture in the EU, where we have very different takes on China even today, even though, as Hanna Smith was saying, we do see more of this idea of a systemic rival also gaining ground in Europe. But take, for example, Germany. We still have a lot of voices that are on the other side on this issue. The same goes for many other big member states as well. So very difficult to get any policy.
Yeah, I mean, for the past, let's say, 40 years, China has been striving towards world multipolarization. And China is a pole in a multipolar world. The question is the European Union a pole in a multipolar world? Of course, it depends on which lenses you look at the world with. If we look at civilian power or soft power, Europe is a pole. If we look at the economy and you calculate the European Union as a one singular unit, obviously the European Union is a major pole. When it comes to international politics, not so much. And if you look at military power, not at all. And for a long time, from the Chinese viewpoint, you know, Europe didn't matter. Where are the European aircraft carriers in East Asia? Where are they? You can't see them. Why would we care? We make business with individual countries. They're much smaller than we are. You know, we can create beneficial contacts, make good business. It depends on how you view the world. And the United States and China, they view the world in terms of military power as well. Due to Europe's history, we don't want to look at the world in those terms so much anymore. But I think that's sort of part of the equation as well. But since we want to focus on civilian power and values, we should emphasize that and, you know, push that through our economy and our strength in that regard. But once again, that requires investment in the future and not this mentality of the last one switching off the lights.
Well, there is an old Chinese saying that when the barbarians are fighting each other, then China is safe. And I think that applies even today, in a sense that I think that in last panel it was there was a comment that China is trying to divide Europe, and then China is trying to divide Europe and America. And I think basically this is true, although China is not doing it that openly, of course. But then on the other hand, it is a very real politic actor in world politics. And it is in many ways like the Soviet Union, because it is a communist country and they have a very distinct view on world politics, and this is based on very realistic reading, even a nihilist reading on what world politics is about. So China is really playing foreign relations with many cards, not only one card. So we have to remember that, and it also has resources to act on tremendously many fronts at the same time, doing at the same time media campaigns, social media campaigns, engaging in people-to-people diplomacy, and then classical diplomacy, and even show of force if necessary, especially in its own region. So we have to remember this, that it is a very skillful and foreign policy actor which has capabilities that even can surprise us. What happened during the corona crisis in the beginning? China created a worldwide campaign of corona aid that it has never done before, and it carried out it mostly through its own nationals already in places in other countries. And this is, I think, one thing that really surprised many, and at least surprised me, how efficiently it could run a global campaign for its own benefit by mobilizing its own nationals abroad, something that the foreign country, a Western country, never could do.
It's very interesting you mentioned this. There are similarities between China and Russia. For Europe, Russia has always been a military threat. China is far away, but it can be, I assume, a military threat in the neighborhood. It has been building its military capacity down to the Pacific, Southern Pacific. Australia has been very nervous about it during the past months. There is the problems with Hong Kong, Taiwan. Now, can this become a European problem as well? Shake up the geopolitical balance. Matlin?
I would actually like to continue what Laura was saying. I mean, there's an old Chinese saying. There are a lot of old Chinese sayings. I spent a couple of days once, years ago, pondering about these old Chinese sayings, because it bugged me as somebody who's been reading Chinese for a long time that I didn't always know where they come from, these supposed old Chinese sayings. And interesting, what happened was that a lot of the supposedly old Chinese sayings, when you look at where they come from, the story went quite similarly in many cases. So there was this Midwestern journalist in the 1920s who went to Shanghai, and he was hanging around in bars. He heard something which he kind of misinterpreted, and he came back and he wrote about it in, San Jose, something, some local paper. Then was picked up by a big paper on the East Coast, and then we had an old Chinese saying. My point being here that China has fascinated us in Europe and in the United States since at least the 18th century. We have had bouts of this fascination, and from romanticism we come to the fear side of this big other out there that we don't quite understand. And I see it as a continuation today. I mean, we are mostly projecting our own fears and hopes and so on China. China goes about its own business and develops in its own way, but most of what happens, what we see here in the debate, really is more a reflection of how we are, our fears about our own uncertain future, for example, or something, and we project it onto China. And we have a tradition of hundreds of years of doing this in the case of China. So there are lots of old Chinese sayings.
Hanna Smith, I want to ask you about this. We go back to those fears, spying, for example, goes to that Huawei negotiations between Europe and China. As a research head of a hybrid center, but is it real? Have we been exaggerating it? The fear, everybody spies in the world, whether it's through satellites or phone lines or web or...
No, it is a real thing, and the interesting thing, I suppose, the change, so to speak, from everybody spies and has always been spying, and even the friends spy to each other, etc., etc. But now the question here is that for what the information is used, and what kind of an information has been spied, and that's kind of. That's the biggest threat in the way that it starts to be much more kind of personalized, getting into a system that should be kind of secured, undermining the democratic society's safety feeling, using that in its own advantage, etc. So there are elements which we kind of thought that had disappeared. We, meaning the democratic states and European Union and so on, also in US. And then we realized that they haven't, and they come back in a modern age with the modern tools and with the new types of a kind of utilization. And that's what is a scary bit, that we don't know exactly how badly they can hit, where they can undermine us or even destabilize the societies for someone else's advantage. So we are talking about potential, not necessarily something that has materialized, but I think today's world we need to much more concentrate on the kind of foresight, the potential, than kind of looking how it was and compare to that.
Okay, are the Chinese any worse as spies as we are the Westerners?
I think they are more centralized, controlled, and they are building the system very, very differently than what the Western countries are doing. And they have the advantage that they are from the authoritarian states. And now, yes, I did talk about authoritarian states having weaknesses, but here they have the advantage of the fact that it can be state-controlled, state-managed, financed, kind of much better and bigger than in the Western case, because we do have some rules that need to be obeyed. There are certain ways this is done, so much more kind of focused and concentrated and not so kind of wide, and the preparation aspects are quite different and so on.
Yes.
Well, China has been normalizing its so-called cyber intelligence activities. It used to be mainly industrial espionage, but in the past, let's say, 5 years, China has, or Xi Jinping has commanded that if we just keep spying on others' technology, we can never take the lead. Instead, China has normalized itself and started to spy on governments, just like everybody else. So China is becoming more normal in this sense as well. When it comes to the cyber realm, we're sort of really worried, what Chinese are spying on us. China is much more vulnerable in terms of cyber attacks and cyber espionage than let's say Finns are. China has the most effective internet control system in the world, and they have a one-party system essentially that controls all communications and has to have strict control of all network communication. This also means that the individual's cybersecurity is very weak, and that means that there's no culture of cybersecurity in China. So individuals, companies, they're all in this sort of jungle where the Communist Party can step in. That makes it very vulnerable for outside attacks as well. And the baseline technology is also American. So if we talk about backdoors, there's all sorts of backdoors in China. On the other hand, we're so afraid of backdoors in Huawei. If you open up any consumer electronics these days, they will have components from China, from America, from all sorts of places. The way they're constructed is chained, and it's very international. So once again, it's a sort of image that's been created for political purposes and American economic interests also.
Valdemar, anything to add? No? Dr. Yu, I give you the last comment here. You mentioned that recognition, that Chinese are looking for recognition as a big power, superpower, global player, as were the Russians when Putin started to build up Russia as a global player. Now, how do you think China can get that, or what the Chinese leaders' government expect from us Europeans so that they would be sort of satisfied, because 3 EU-China summits went pretty much belly up last year, and I suspect one of the reasons was the lack of recognition, instead of seeing them as just spies. Please.
Yeah. I mean, there's no really easy solution here. I think this whole notion of seeking recognition really driven from back to the old days, back to the 1970s. China returned to the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China, PRC, returned to the UN Security Council and considered itself as re-emerged back to the center of the world stage. And lately, when China joined WTO back to 2001, and then that really created a wave that China felt itself return to the center of the global affairs. And also plus because of that economic strength, and especially right after the global financial crisis. Therefore, both the elites and also wider public of China, and hoping that its own contribution, its own economic contribution to the world should be rightfully recognized. And therefore, with perhaps the media, especially the Western major media, would be more lenient towards China in terms of its behaviors, in terms of its diplomatic measures. So this is what China was hoping to get. I mean, if we're talking about information, if we're talking about spy, I mean, I'm not really a specialist on any of the subject at all. And what I do know is that when it comes to selecting information, reporting the information back home, and that seems to be the one thing that the Chinese media is very good at. And they really want to show a picture to its own population that China will be really widely respected. I mean, give you a very classic example, back to 2015, when the Chinese President Xi Jinping visited UK, and apparently the UK government has rolled up the red carpet and Xi Jinping received by the Queen. Then it actually really does the show, not to the world audience, but actually for the domestic audience at home, to show that how confident China it is and show how confident that Chinese leadership it is. So I think that's many things that Chinese diplomacy has been doing on foreign policy agenda. It is really to serve the domestic audience, that domestic audience very much keen to be seen itself as being a center of the world. So I think that's really sometimes when it comes to disinformation, when it comes to the pandemic narrative, and even on this origin of the COVID thing, this discussion, it is about China seeking itself as being recognized, as being a rightful member of international society.
Thank you for that last comment. We are running out of time. I'm asking the audience, is there anybody raising a hand and wishes to ask any of the panelists something? Do I see a hand anywhere? Yes. There. And if you have a specific question to one of the panelists, please do so.
Tia Lehto from the British Embassy. Thank you very much for this excellent debate. A question possibly for Hannah Smith and Dr. Yu. How do you see the China-Russia relationship currently, and how do you see this going forward?
Hannah Smith, and then Dr. Yu.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And I'm making a little announcement in the way that, or advert, that we are actually at the Hybrid COE now about to launch a project which is comparing Russia and China, because this is one of those themes that is actually very, very important. So looking at their cooperation, but also the differences, weaknesses, capabilities, etc. And to answer the question shortly from this perspective is that it is very troubled, I would say, because there are exactly these things that they're leaning towards each other when it comes to challenging the West, the democracy. And this is what is the nudge here, is that we do have an ideological battle going on between authoritarians and democracies. And here Russia and China find themselves. But then the picture becomes much more nuanced. There are problems relating to Central Asia. On the digital domain, they have big questions also when it comes to the Arctic. Perhaps the list could go on. So in that way, Russia fears China, but also kind of needs it for its cooperation about this regime survival. And I would say that China has a little bit of similarities, not necessarily a fear, but annoyance relating to Russia, understanding that also Russia can play China. But currently they try, as authoritarian regimes always, look very powerful, and there is no trouble in their cooperation. So I think that's what they want us to believe, but then we need to look at below the surface, and we find quite interesting stuff.
Dr. Yu.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, similarly, that China recognized Russia on the diplomatic prestige because Russia wants to be being recognized. That's one thing. But when it comes to substantial collaboration between the two countries, I think we can find very little. I mean, just give a very classic example on the Belt and Road Initiative since it launched in the past 7 years. Even the Russian government has suggested that like to coordinate on this initiative, but never really happened anything with a substantial project, because clearly Russia aware that if China, to allow China entering in the backyard, so-called Central Asia, and China would play a much bigger economic influence, and that would somehow undermine Russia's influence within the region. So Russia would be very cautious when it comes to cooperate with China on things. And also secondly, I think the two countries see the world very differently. They hold very different worldview. For example, for China, it's about putting itself in the center of the international stage, but engaged with the world economically, using its economic means to achieve political influence, where, however, for Russia, it's more about the traditional ways of territorial conquest, is all more about taking a step in the MENA region and to show that Russia remains relevant. So I think it's a different means to achieve different ends. I think the two countries are very different. And putting in one word, that two countries' relations is perhaps at its best at it currently, but it probably won't go getting closer any further, precisely for the reasons which were outlined.
No, then I thank you, Dr. Yu Ji. It was really interesting to hear your voice and ideas and thoughts from London, and of course our panelists, Professor Paltema Vuorio Matlin and Hanna Smith from Hybrid Center.